All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 139 today. We actually did 139 the other day on Maurice's Spiritual Awakening. However, that file got corrupted somehow in the process of doing the live stream, so we're probably going to do that this weekend or early next week, so stay tuned for that. But so today we are going to do Secret of the Norse. We have Arthur Koopmans back, and we're going to be doing Comets and Catastrophe. He has another slideshow ready to go, but we're going to talk a little bit before we do that. And you can check out his links. I have it down below the video. He has a blog and a website. And welcome back on the show, Arthur.
It's good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. It's a perfect time to get this comet information out there because we're going through one right now.
Yep, exactly. I saw a comet myself last weekend, Comet Neowise.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you heard of that too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I told Maurice, because Maurice does photography and some astrophotography, I told him you should get out there and try and get a picture of it. So the best way to see that comet, though, isn't that during, like, dusk? Or
Yeah.
dawn or somewhere like at the...
I think it's around 10, but I could be mistaken. 10 p.m.
Yeah. Here at least it's at dusk. So when things are getting a bit darker, then you can see this faint comet on the northern sky.
Nice.
Yeah, there's too much light pollution here in Chicago. I can barely even see the main stars here. But yeah, it's from your you took a picture and you posted it on Twitter, and that was actually a pretty good pic. Did you use a camera or did you use your phone?
Well, that's funny because I had two pictures as an illustration, and I basically took those from the internet. So one was from Sky and Telescope with information on when to see it, and the other one was just to illustrate what it looks like. Although I tried to get a picture of it, but yeah, I don't really have a good camera, so I tried it with my phone, but I couldn't see the comet on it. So. But I wanted to share my experience anyway, because
sure.
yeah, I believe it's the first time I saw one in my life. So
yeah, that's it's interesting. You think that it would be easy to take a picture of like the moon or some of the stars or whatever, and you hold your phone up and you realize there's no way of actually getting it unless you have a decent DSLR with like a nice lens and stuff like that. So, but yeah, it was a cool pic regardless. So this is part two. Part one, we just focused on the mythology, and the correlations and connections. And since we've had you on, we've also had David Mathisen on, who went through all of his body of work with the constellations and stuff. And did you see this article that came out within the last 2 days too? How NASA acknowledged Ophiuchus, which it normally doesn't, and normally people think of the constellations as just 12 constellations of the zodiac, but now that there's 13 and people are freaking out, so they redid all the dates for the the different constellations.
Okay, well, I haven't seen that article recently, but I do remember that I've heard the exact same thing earlier, that this constellation Ophiuchus was now recognized as the 13th zodiac constellation. So, well, I'm Sagittarius myself. I don't really check horoscopes. That's not really my thing. But, that means that I will be Ophiuchus now, the snake holder. So,
yeah, I'm not a big astrology guy. However, I do wonder if the ancient times, through mysticism and different ancient secret type, knowledge and stuff, if there is something to the way that the stars and the planets and the way we revolve around anything and resonate and the vibration, if it does have some sort of effect on your personality and consciousness, and if maybe there is some way of affecting your consciousness in that regard. Not necessarily like, if you're Virgo, you're this, or if you're Sagittarius, you're this, but just in the sense that maybe it has some sort of archetypal influence on you where
Yeah.
certain things do come out. So I do wonder that. I'm not saying that I necessarily believe in
Yeah,
astrology.
you could argue that there is this psychological aspect to it, perhaps.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think scientists are telling us that the influences of very distant celestial bodies are minimal. But I do think there may be some things still that need to be researched that could actually have more influence on life on Earth than we think. And well, the phenomena of comets and how they can affect our life may be one of these underestimated things.
Absolutely. So yeah, I just wanted to, but the NASA thing was interesting. Supposedly they say this article comes out every few years and people forget about it. But yeah, they posted a picture of the constellations and it had Ophiuchus in there. And to be honest with you, I've heard, before we did the first episode with you, I'd heard of Ophiuchus. I had seen the constellation, but it's not like one of the top regular. It's not one of the ones where people think about or can point to. Usually, it's a little bit more of an obscure one. So, do you have a reasoning why you think that is, or do you think that since different, ancient mythologies incorporate it, that it's just something that maybe gets lost in translation for different cultures?
Yeah, well, Ophiuchus, for the most part of my life, I really didn't know that it existed either. So the first thing you are familiar with is Orion and Sirius and all that. But to the ancients, it seems that Ophiuchus was a pretty important constellation, and a lot of mythological figures are linked to it. And yeah, there could be various reasons why that could be. One of them is that it was at the equinox a couple of thousand years ago, in an age when a lot of these myths were created. So I think that could have contributed to the importance of Ophiuchus in this ancient system.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into the beef of this conversation, which is comets and catastrophe, and looking at the ancient world and looking at the mythology and trying to correlate those two things. So where do you want to start with this? Do you have a particular subtopic within this, or do you want to just start riffing on it, or did you have part of your presentation incorporated in this?
Well, I can just start with giving an introduction, and then you guys can ask questions.
Sure.
If you want. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so the last time that we've talked, I've shown you how the Norse myths can be linked to the stars and constellations. And David Mathisen has, in the previous episode, given a very convincing proof that the world's myths are based on this ancient system of astronomy. And so well, I discovered some things for myself by getting familiar with David Mathisen's research, learning the vocabulary of these myths. And I've shown you how Odin's discovery of the runes too can be seen in the stars. But I think there's another very important way of viewing the myths, and that is that they possibly contain memories of catastrophic events that have happened in the human timeline. That these myths contain accounts of cosmic impacts. And I think that these memories of these ancient impacts too could have been passed down in the form of star myths. So I think these two ways of viewing can also fit together in the same system.
So do you think that when you've had the research that you've done, have you found any correlation, like cross correlations between different civilizations in a specific time period or comet? Obviously we have, Randall Carlson, Graham Hancock, and all those, George Howard, all these people promoting the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And there's obviously a lot of evidence to support that. So obviously that's one of them, but is there any other point that you found throughout the ancient history where it seemed like something happened across these cultures, or even with
definitely
the Viking mythology?
Yeah, so the Younger Dryas impact event, that was the really, really big one. And so a lot of authors like Graham Hancock, they think that all these myths, which contain stories of catastrophe, that those are all linked perhaps to this Younger Dryas impact event. But well, as we will see, there were many more of these episodes, and I have also seen signs how they are can be linked to different myths. So yeah, we find these tales of catastrophe. We find them all over the world. You have the apocalypse in the Bible, and also Noah's flood. There's been hypothesized, for example, that Noah's flood is perhaps linked to an impact off the coast of Madagascar, the Burkle impact crater.
Right.
So that would have created quite some destruction in the region of the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, and you also have the Epic of Gilgamesh. I mean, there's flood myths all over the world, and you can check that kind of stuff out. There's Hamlet's Mill is a good resource for that, with all those kinds of tales too. And I think Graham Hancock references it a decent amount as well through his work. In terms of these catastrophes, what is the mythology saying? Is it, because there's some coded things, like, for instance, not to keep bringing them up, but Graham Hancock talks about, the serpent in the sky, and, you have John Anthony West, and this idea that these comets had kind of looked like a snake with a tail or something along those lines. Do you think is that something that's found within the Viking mythology, or is that something that you think is misinterpreted, or is that, where do you go with that?
Well, there are definitely there's a lot of episodes of descriptions of catastrophe and natural disasters in more than one Norse myth. So and I also think that these can be linked to comets. So it's kind of hard to discern what actually refers to a comet, because you have these gods, you have these terrible monsters. Some of these gods could be linked to the sun, for example, and some of the giant snakes, those could be linked to comets. But when I started researching it further, it seems like even the gods themselves could perhaps be linked to comet symbolism, and sometimes even very subtle symbolism. So it may be more widespread than you would at first think.
So do you think that, have you ever found a case where maybe a specific god was linked to a specific celestial event or comet? Have you found that?
Yeah, well, there are, you have the story of Thor's fishing trip, for example, that does describe how he fishes for the Midgard serpent. It's this world encircling serpent, Jormungandr. And when he fishes for it, he uses an ox's head and a bull's head as bait for this giant monster. So you have the bull and you have the serpent. So there could be some zodiac symbolism in there. So these two constellations were at the equinox in the age of Taurus. And plus you also have the Taurid meteor stream. That's where all the major cosmic bombardments come from. So perhaps this bull also refers to the radius where these cosmic impacts came from. So that's one example. But I've prepared several other examples, which I'll also show you in the slideshow.
Okay.
So we will definitely get to that.
And you have the people, and we talked a little bit about this with Dave and Mathisen, but you have people that take some of these things literally. You have other people doing kind of the research that you're doing, where it's a little bit more esoteric and fringe in the context of what mainstream is or popular culture. But when you look at these things, how do you know that you're right? So in context, so like you have people that would say, if you look at some of these myths or mythology, like the Kraken, well, now they're finding massive giant squid that are like 100 feet long at the very bottom of the ocean
Yeah.
that they didn't know even existed before. So they're saying that could be
Right.
the real Kraken. So like where does this line get drawn in terms of what could be real and why? Is it just an analogy or some sort of correlation?
Yeah, so I think the myths they work on multiple different levels. So maybe there was an actual kraken. Maybe science proved that there was this beast, but maybe this kraken was also used as a symbol for something else. When you have a flaming sword, for example, that splits the sky in two, well, we know that swords existed. There were actual swords, but the sword can also be used as a symbol, perhaps for a comet. So when people would have witnessed these terrifying events, these world-destroying events on whatever scale, they would have had to describe these things in terms that they were familiar with. They had to use symbols that were a part of their everyday world. So they used what was at hand. So a cosmic mill, for example, a grindstone. That's something that they used in their daily lives. And if that visually resembles something they see in the sky, for example, and that they would use such a symbol.
So where do you go with all this, the mythology and the correlations and stuff? Do you believe that, like David Mathisen, that there's some ancient knowledge or wisdom to be gained other than knowing about these celestial events, or do you simply think that these are just correlations to natural phenomenon and that was their way of explaining it or telling a tale?
Well, the more I see how large a role these cosmic catastrophes have played in human history, I think that is a large part of what the myths are about. But I think people who compose these poems, they also put other esoteric knowledge in it of various kinds. So advanced astronomical knowledge, precessional numbers, and also perhaps some entheogenic elements to it, some shamanic elements, and all sorts of wisdom that these astronomer priests had. And I think that's one of the reasons that these stories are so popular and still with us today, is because people see value in them. So these events, they saw these things and they personalized it, I think, and gave meaning to it, so that their world makes some sense and is filled with meaning.
Yeah, I brought that up to him too, the fact that I think that with strong evidence of entheogenic use within that culture and a lot of ancient civilizations, that might have just enhanced the ability to tell the story and to picture or visualize, because with anybody that's ever done, psychedelics or high dose psychedelics, you have this free thinking way or unabridged version of what your mind can do, kind of a thing. So while you might just look up at the stars and imagine this myth playing out, by taking an entheogen, you're able to walk around and you're in it. There's no way of getting out of it once you do it. So in a way, I think that could have actually enhanced some of these stories or myths, in my opinion, but based on what I've seen.
Yeah, I think so too. I even Googled to see if whether if you're in an altered state, if you can somehow see the constellations, see the stars in a different way. What happens when you're under influence of some substance and you look at the stars? And someone claimed that he could see these lines started appearing automatically. So that's what's kind of what I was looking for. But apart from that, I couldn't really find something like it. So that's a bit anecdotal, but perhaps that there is some element to it.
I can vouch for the fact that I've on a high dose of psilocybin that a long time ago when I was camping, me and one of my friends were looking up at the sky, and there was one of those lightning storms. There wasn't rain, it wasn't thunder, it was just lightning. And you did look like you were looking at like some sort of light show from God, or you could say the gods or whatever. So
yeah.
I definitely, based on that experience, I just felt like I was in awe of the fact that this is actually happening, and this is, even if it's just nature, it's this beautiful, amazing thing. So I could definitely see how somebody would correlate that to some sort of higher power for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So you guys are quite familiar by now with the Younger Dryas impact event, I think, and I think many of the listeners are as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe we could recap really briefly what that was about, because I think that the Norse Ragnarok myth may be linked to that and may contain some traces of that. So it was basically.
Yeah, do you want me to, so like, for anybody that doesn't know what the Younger Dryas impact event is, so there's evidence to suggest that there was a comet impact at the end of the last ice age that caused the meltdown and the flooding and the flood myths that you see, and the dating goes back to 13 to 11,000 years ago, and you have people correlating that to Göbekli Tepe, which is roughly 11,600 years old. You have now there's 2 crater impacts I believe they found in Iceland,
Greenland, I think.
Greenland. I'm sorry, You're right, and they haven't been able to date them, I think, because they're too deep or something like that.
Yeah. Preliminary dating shows that they are linked to the Younger Dryas event, but it's not conclusive yet.
Right. So they've done that, and then there's also people that connect. We've done episodes on like the Carolina Bays and Saginaw, possibly in Michigan, being connected to all that, and like the fallout from this comet. It's Comet Enki, I believe, from the Taurid meteor stream.
Yeah, I think fragments from Comet Enki. Enki itself is, I think, still out there.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
So these would have been fragments, and also there was, there's discussion whether this thing blew up as it was entering the atmosphere and then showered over everything, or if maybe there's multiple, impacts from different celestial bodies, and they found microspherules and microdiamonds and stuff all over the planet. And if you're looking for a good resource on that stuff, obviously you have Randall Carlson, who has a podcast now, Cosmographia. He does with the Snake Brothers. Shout out to them. And I think that this whole thing does. It has a lot of weight and it has a lot of evidence, and even some of the academics are coming around. I think Mark Defont even started to entertain the idea, which he did not before. So
yeah. So basically, it was you could say a world-ending event. Entire human cultures died out. The Coast people in North America and Europe, it was the Vedermesser culture. These giant wildfires burning 10% of the biomass. The world basically ended in fire and ice. And
the megafauna thing too. That's what Randall would point to, is the woolly mammoths look like they've been ripped off their feet, through the frozen ones and different things like that. So, I think that there is a lot of physical and geological evidence.
Yeah, definitely. It could be that this Ragnarok myth, which describes the end of the world, goes all the way back to this period. But there were more episodes of cosmic bombardment since, so they may not have been as severe, but they would still have been very disruptive, changing the global climate, and it could have spelled the end for entire cultures. So the Bronze Age collapse, that's what was one of these periods. And also the Dark Ages, the start of the medieval period, was also a pretty catastrophic period, actually.
I've never looked into it, but have you ever looked into the pre-civilization history of that area of Scandinavia and the Viking territories of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway and all those? Because obviously with Göbekli Tepe there is we know that there was a civilization there roughly around that time. So is there anything that you found that correlates to that, maybe in that area?
Well, I haven't seen correlations, I think, yet with Göbekli Tepe. That's something I would have to research further. But there was some human activity in Scandinavia at a quite early point. But it would have been more locked in ice, still more so than the region of Anatolia.
Right. Yeah,
so that there was less human activity. Hunter-gatherers. Maybe some very early small settlements by the water. The Viking Age, it started somewhere around 800 AD.
Okay.
So well before that, there were already people there.
Yeah, obviously you have Neolithic activity in a lot of parts of the world. It's just, that's why I was curious, is because that far north you would have still been somewhat, I think, under ice, or at least close to what would be considered kind of an unlivable habitat. However, we're human beings and we find ways to live in super unlivable, environments. So that's why I was curious about that.
And we have even survived the Younger Dryas. So
Lake
we are pretty
Lake Toba event. I mean, you can go through. And there's a lot of them.
It was actually this rogue star that passed by our solar system that possibly caused this supervolcano event.
Yeah.
It's called Schultz's star.
Okay. I'll have to look into that because we just did that.
You have to look that up, yeah.
Yeah, because we just did that super volcano episode. So.
Yeah. We're going to talk about volcanoes too. There's some of that in the slideshow. So,
all right. Yeah, that's exciting.
But
So yeah, that's the premise, I think, around the Younger Dryas. We've talked about it in the past, and like I said, I mean, you can look at stuff up. The best, I think, episode on it is the Joe Rogan with Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson and Michael Shermer. Well, that one's kind of controversial. There's other ones where it's just Randall and Graham showing slides and talking about it and stuff. So, but I think those are episodes around like 600, 700 Joe Rogan. Yeah. So, but yeah, is there anything else you want to get to before we get into the slideshow?
A short introduction to Ragnarok, and then we can start the slideshow.
Okay.
Ragnarok is this prophecy of the end of the world. Some think it can't be a description of a past event because it tells about things that will happen in the future. That's not really how I see it. Because why would people make this whole story up when we know that there were these catastrophic events in our history? So to me, it makes more sense that they have witnessed such an event, and that's what inspired the tale of Ragnarok. It was then created into this prophecy for something that will happen again.
And is it similar to, like, is it a Greek word, I believe, apocalypse, which means just lifting the veil or the unveiling, where some people associate that with total destruction, but in reality it actually means maybe something a little bit more esoteric and different?
Yeah, could be. I don't know exactly what the word apocalypse means, but it's also always more complicated than that. Yeah. So let's go.
There's a lot of characters named that in American society. So I don't know. There's a lot of. Let's see here. The complete destruction of the world is the definition, as described in biblical books.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but what's the origin of the word? Is what I was asking.
The destruction one says it's from the book of Revelations.
Yeah.
Let me see in the
I think Randall Carlson would know.
Yeah, we need him on.
I think
that would be great.
We are working on that, actually. I don't know when or how soon, but at some point. But what, in terms of, it's a Greek word meaning the unveiling or unfolding.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's what I meant by it. It doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, it's associated because of the Bible. It's associated with death and destruction, but really it just means the unveiling, which I guess you could take,
It's a bit more subtle.
And I think of it as like this, like hypothetically, let's say we're in a simulation. The unveiling could be you find out that you're in the simulation, thus ending this world or this reality. So I think about things like that in terms of, what's the interpretation of that? Back then, for them, it might have been like God coming down and ending things or something like that.
Well, if a giant bright comet is coming down from the sky, it would kind of be like, God is back.
Yeah.
Here's the big reveal. Throw some objects on you.
Surprise, you're all dead.
Yeah.
Time to create new worlds,
Yeah.
So,
okay. So, do you want me to pull up the slideshow now, or?
Yes, let's do it.
All right, here we go. And this was... all right, we are ready to roll.
Yeah. So this is the title page, Comets and Catastrophe in Norse myth. So I think we can go right to slide number 2. Okay, so the Ragnarok story is found in the Valdespa. It is a poem on the Poetic Edda, which is the main source for the Norse myths. And Ragnarok means the fate of the ruling powers, which includes the gods and the giants, or the doom of the gods. And in a play on words, it's also called Ragnarökr, which means the twilight of the gods. So it's described as the cyclical destruction of the cosmos and of the gods in it, although there is some dispute over whether it was intended as a cyclical event, because some older sources don't mention the renewal of the world, but that is how it is presented in the Valdespa. So the poem starts with Odin, and he is raising this dead Ceres from the grave. And he wants to know everything that there is to know to prevent Ragnarok from happening. So he disturbs her rest, and he wants to question her. And she starts giving him all these details about what will happen at the end of the world. So some of the events that will happen is the sun will be devoured by wolves, snow will fall in the summers, the world tree Yggdrasil is shaking, mankind will be abandoned by its gods, the world is destroyed in fire and ice, and finally the earth will sink beneath the waves. So that's pretty world-ending stuff.
Yeah.
So the first omen that Ragnarok is at hand is that the world becomes a place of complete darkness, which you'll see in the next slide.
Okay.
So there are these wolves, and they are together with other monsters' offspring, the children of Loki and this giantess witch called Angerboda. And Fenrir is one of these, this wolf, and it starts becoming a threat to the gods because it's getting bigger and bigger, because it's getting fed all the time, and the gods started getting anxious, so they trick it and bind it with a magical thread. But at Ragnarok, all these ropes will break and the wolf will run free. And they will eventually devour the sun and the moon, and Fenrir's jaws are so big that it will devour the entire sky. So in the poem, the seeress says to Odin, "There feeds he full on the flesh of the dead, and the home of the gods he reddens with gore. Dark grows the sun, and in summer soon come mighty storms. Would you like to know more?" So
yes, I would.
Okay, well, let's go to the next slide.
Okay, winter is coming, it says.
Yeah, this
yes.
Game of Thrones.
Exactly. So yeah, whenever there is 3 years without a summer, then you better prepare for Ragnarok. You know that the end of the world is coming. And George R.R. Martin with Game of Thrones, there was basically also a story of his books, Winter is Coming.
Right.
And this battle between fire and ice. So you can imagine that when climate gets so cold, all the crops will start failing. People will start growing hungry. and they will fight for resources. So there will be this struggle for survival. So when we look at real events in history, we can ask ourselves what can cause such a terrible winter. So we know that there is such a thing as nuclear winter.
Mm-hmm.
If you drop enough nuclear bombs, that could cause a prolonged winter because all this dust is blocking the light of the sun.
Right.
And well, in the myth, it's described as wolves devouring the sky. But there are other things that could cause such a thing, such as a comet impact. And in the Younger Dryas, basically, there was so much dust in the atmosphere that the world, it was just retreating from the ice age. But then, boom, you have another ice age for 1,000 years.
Mm.
But there are also volcanoes, of course. You've shown in your supervolcano video how a eruption of a supervolcano can cause this volcanic winter.
Yeah, actually can cause a discrepancy in temperature or a change in temperature. I think up to like 26 degrees Celsius is the highest that they've recorded. I mean, that's a lot. You know, we're all worried about 2 degrees, you know, which is actually a big deal. But then you look at the potential of a 26 or 25. I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah, if it goes down enough, then this can disturb the entire equilibrium of the planet.
Yeah, I mean, and that would make sense if 3 years of without summer, some sort of super volcano or large eruption happening somewhere else in the world could definitely have an effect, causing the weather patterns to change. And I mean, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. So and the Younger Dryas event also had these massive wildfires. So that too would cause all this dust. And eventually this big freeze. And there was another period in history in which such a thing happened, and that is the Dark Ages. So the Dark Ages too were an episode in history of a global cooldown and also excessive volcanism. It was the time of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And a lot of these tribes from Northern Europe started migrating to the south, and they started creating all these new kingdoms. Some speculate that perhaps it was the Dark Ages that was the inspiration for this Fimbul winter, this terrible winter that precedes Ragnarok. And we know that in the years 536 and 540 AD, there were two major massive volcanic eruptions of the volcano at Lake Ilopango in El Salvador.
Yeah, that's going to be part 2 of our super volcano one. Actually, that's
all right.
So I think you're onto something here for sure.
Yeah. 522 was probably another eruption. So that's 3 in all. So in Constantinople, that was in the Eastern Roman Empire. There was the sun was obscured. It had this bluish tint, and there was this large dust cloud visible in the air, and the temperatures in the whole Mediterranean cooled. So you can imagine up further north what the climate must have been like then, where it is already colder. And when it gets colder, crops fail, people go hungry, their immune systems go down, and then you have this bubonic plague breaking out, which is called the Justinian plague after the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian. So it was a pretty catastrophic period. And what's interesting, not only are there signs of volcanism, but there's also evidence of the sighting of a comet in ancient Latin and Greek texts. They speak of a bright comet that was visible in the sky for more than 40 days. And also in the Greenland ice cores, they found some spherules. So there's some debate whether that is volcanic or indicative of a comet impact episode. But there are signs that there were also cosmic impacts involved in which contributed to this global cooldown.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that obviously people at this point had a good knowledge. I mean, we've talked about in our ancient Greek series that a lot of these pre-Socratics were able to predict the lunar cycles and like celestial events like a eclipse and things like that. So if that was happening, 500 BC, I see no reason why they wouldn't be able to document these things and have good knowledge of them, 1,000 years later.
Yeah. So the Chinese too, they documented the same comet. So they were often a little bit more precise in their data than the Greeks, but yeah. So in the next slide, so what I'm wondering also, is there a link between Comet and volcanism as well? Because every time you look at these catastrophic events, you see signs of volcanism, but also signs of cosmic impacts. So off the coast of Australia, at the Carpentaria Gulf, there are 2 craters, which look like they can be impact craters, and they are dated to 1,500 years ago, which is the time of the Dark Ages. But possibly even when a comet is large enough and close enough to the Earth, perhaps it can have some gravitational effects, which could perhaps also cause comets to erupt in multiple places. Plus, the direct site of an impact could also create earthquakes and even break open the crust and cause this volcanic activity.
Yeah, so that's something we discussed with Chris Cottrell on the Tidal Forces episode, and something we talked about on the supervolcano episode is that they don't know the mechanism behind what causes the hot spots in our core. Some people theorize that it could be like one of these impacts, breaking through and getting that deep somehow. Others have, postulated that, there's just some sort of mechanism that's unknown that we just don't know the process that happens in there. So, but yeah, I definitely think
it's a strange thought for sure.
It's something to at least look into and entertain. And I think that, I don't know if we'll get any answers in our lifetime, but hopefully they start looking into more of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I really hope so too. Because the two do seem to go together. Also in the Younger Dryas, you have this massive volcanism as well. So, plus when you look at the Dark Ages, Martin Swepman, the author of Prehistory Decoded, he also noted in his book that during the Dark Ages, the Earth too crossed the denser part of the Taurid meteor stream. So you would expect increased comet and meteorite activity somewhere around the year between the year 0 and the Dark Ages. So could this have caused this Fimbulwinter? That could be, or perhaps the Fimbulwinter describes the Younger Dryas. Those are interesting questions, I think. And I think the Ragnarok myth could also be multiple catastrophes combined in one, which makes it sort of outside time, something cyclical that recurs again, sort of meta catastrophe. So that's also an interesting thought. And the land in which these Norse myths were composed, Iceland, is also a land of fire and ice. So that could also have contributed somewhat to the imagery of Ragnarok.
Yeah, we've had Martin on. We did a 2-part thing with him. He's a smart guy, and he that book's pretty good. So check that out if you haven't. I don't know what episodes we did with them, but you can look back. It's been a while. It's probably been like 70 episodes or so. I wanted to point something out. You mentioned on one of the earlier slides of the Earth falling into the seas or the seas rising. So I mean, to me that spells out some sort of flood or like you're saying, some cyclical thing. So if it's a common impact at the end of the Ice Age and during the Younger Dryas period, maybe that's what they're describing or something along those lines.
Yeah, so I think these things have happened multiple times, I think. But it could be that this one really big event triggered the creation of this myth. And then when more catastrophes happened, perhaps details get added to that story. So that's also certainly possible. So on the next slide, here you see I've created a timeline which gives an oversight of just all these different events that have happened since the Younger Dryas up until the Dark Ages. So you have the Younger Dryas, 10,800 BC, and you have the Dark Ages on the right, and then you also have the Bronze Age collapse around 1100 BC.
Mm-hmm.
And in between, you also have all these so-called kiloyear events. And kiloyear basically means 1,000 years. So 4.2 kiloyear event means 4,200 years ago. So those two, I think, have left their marks in the mythology.
Mm-hmm.
And most of these would have been caused by impacts from the torrid meteor stream, from the fragments of the same giant comet,
Yep.
which Martin Swartman has dubbed Comet Satan.
I mean, it makes sense, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
yeah, that's a nice little timeline you got there. In terms of, so is there any, I guess, do they have names for this possibly? Like, have you found anything that could be correlated, like, as a name to this thing that causes the destruction? Is it actual, because I'm not really familiar with the Ragnarok. I mean, I know about it, I know what it means and everything, but in the actual myth or the tale, does it talk about a specific name for whatever's causing this destruction? And is there any correlation between that and anything else?
Well, I think that the myth speaks in symbols, and we will see some examples of those symbols. So you have these gods fighting these monsters in this cosmic battle between order and chaos. So I think it's this giant battle that causes all this destruction. So gods and monsters alike in their fight destroy the world. It's almost like two galaxies colliding. One is matter, one is antimatter. And when they touch this, you have this giant explosion and they cancel each other out. So, yeah, metaphorically speaking, that is, I think, what is described in the Ragnarok myth. So, the Ragnarok myth, to get back to the poem, describes also the coming of an age of violence. So, the seer says to Odin, "Brothers shall fight and fell each other. Cousins shall violate kinship. Hard it is on earth with mighty whoredom. Axe age, sword age, shields are sundered. Wind age, wolf age. Ere the world falls, no man will spare another." So, what the poem describes is that people will grow violent, probably because the climate is worsening. That affects people's morality. So this is moral decay. You see the same in the Kali Yuga of the Vedic tradition. It's a hard time to live in. The gods have abandoned man. There is no spirituality. There is meanness, and trust is broken. And you have the same thing described in the Greek Iron Age.
What do you think about that idea? This idea that there's cycles. There's a golden age. There's all these different bronze. There's Iron Age. Do you think that there's something to that, or do you think it's specifically tied to these cataclysms? And what I mean by that is, obviously, you can go if there's a long period of time without cataclysm, your civilization has a better chance of advancing way past where it was before. So do you think that that's what they're talking about, or do you think that there's some literal connection to some sort of metaphysical thing that happens? Because I think that people use that in both of those contexts, where one just means, the physical civilization advance, but then there's other people that are in the
There's also this spiritual element to it. So in the Golden Age, when people are more spiritually aware, they are less concerned with material things because life is good, so they have the luxury to just enjoy things and the beauty of it. And I think these cycles, you find them on every level of existence. So you have these cycles of catastrophe, which are linked to the orbit of meteor streams and the planets and the sun. Possibly on a greater scale, on a galactic scale, perhaps a binary system. But also on a more personal level, you also have these generational cycles. For example, you have perhaps a 20-year-long golden age, and then start building up towards a sort of crisis. Plus, when the weather is good, people tend to become more active and they start building cathedrals and all this stuff.
Right.
So warmer weather is also correlated, I think, with this idea of a golden age.
Right. No, absolutely.
But regarding this increased violence, there's something strange that happened in the Bronze Age, it seems, which you'll see on the next slide.
Okie dokie.
Yeah. So around 1500 BC, you suddenly start seeing a large increase of violence. That's the thesis of Graham Phillips' book, End of Eden. And he put the pieces together and he found that around this date, all these things happened all over the world. So things were relatively peaceful in megalithic Europe, for example. In Western Europe, you had this megalithic civilization, which built all these large stone structures. And they were relatively peaceful. There's not really signs of large-scale warfare or people with horrible battle wounds and all that. Plus, they built these henches like Avebury. And they weren't really built as fortifications because they have the ditch on the inside, whereas with a fortification, you would expect it on the outside as a protective barrier. But then around 1500 BC, you see it started being transformed into this fortification. You see people with horrible wounds. It's not just there, but all over the world. In America, Egypt, China, Japan, India gets invaded by people who have horse chariots. So what caused all this mindless violence? Was it caused by climate change? Graham Phillips thinks there's not really an indication that climate was particularly bad. So you had this cold epoch, but that sort of started to end around 1500 BC. So what else could have caused this? He asked.
Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic too in human beings that we, when something happens like what's going on now or in the past with cataclysms, people tend to hoard resources and become very, kind of reverting back to more of our animalistic nature. And when you look at the history of stuff, that's not the only thing that causes it too. I mean, right now we're experiencing what I would say, there's a lot of people that don't believe in religions anymore, aren't spiritual, aren't connected to any sort of higher purpose or power. We were losing our telos or our purpose. So I think that even Socrates saw that back then, and I've mentioned this many times on the podcast. He envisioned that a world without any sort of connection or purpose or higher purpose would be a very dangerous situation in terms of you would lose moral order and you would start to lose that aspect of it, which people modern times would argue against that, saying, oh no, it's just our evolutionary, or the biology of us that's created that. But I tend to disagree. I think that we need some sort of framework to work off of.
Framework, a sort of metaphysical, spiritual framework that gives meaning to our lives.
Right.
Yeah. So that can be something really personal, of course. But it could also be something on a societal level, binding people together in ritual.
Yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean like read the Bible or believe this religion or you have to believe in the bearded Zeus-looking god or anything like that, but just some sort of higher purpose or higher calling, I think.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think there did happen something around the Bronze Age that could have triggered this higher calling, but in a perhaps more malevolent way. So in the year 1486 BC, in the Chinese records, it is described that there was this very large and bright comet, and it had 10 tails. And you see the sort of symbols there on the top.
Right.
That's from the Chinese Silk Almanac. And before that, they really weren't paying attention to comets. But then this giant bright comet appeared, and suddenly they did start to pay attention. And they started recording all these comets. And Carl Sagan, he identified this comet as 12P Pons Brooks. And it would have had the size of about 4 full moons in the sky. So it took up a large portion of the sky. And So this could have been seen as this god descending from heaven. Suddenly, around that time, you see all this winged disc symbolism appear with deities in it. And this is also the time that monotheism started to emerge.
Yeah, Akhenaten and the Aten.
Akhenaten, yeah. So the Aten may have been, some people think it was the sun disk, but it may actually have been this comet with all these rays
that's an
coming
interesting
out of it.
take. I've never actually thought about that before, and I've looked heavily into it, but I've never actually, I've always, like you said, thought or associated him with, looking at the sun in that kind of a way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I never thought that might be the case. I got to go back and look at some stuff.
So that was definitely also an eye-opener for me, indeed. Suddenly you start seeing...
Because there are rays that come off of it that do look like tails, too.
And and they don't...
It could also be sun rays, too, but yeah, I mean, I definitely think it warrants further looking into it.
But these rays, they don't extend in all directions, but only in one direction. They spread out like a fan, just as a comet.
And we know that they paid attention to meteorites and stuff because... King Tut's dagger is made out of iron from a meteorite. So, I mean, we know that they were looking for those things in the desert.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there was also this whole meteorite stone called the Benben stone. Mm-hmm. So they were also kind of worshipping these things. So, you could ask the question, was monotheism the cause for all this violence to erupt? Or was there something else? Was the sight of this giant comet enough to trigger all this warfare?
Yeah.
So Graham Phillips thinks that may have not been enough. So he wondered, was there perhaps some toxic chemical in the comet still that caused this violent behavior? So he asked one of his NASA friends. And she said, yes, well, actually there is this chemical vasopressin. And it's found in some comets, and it can, in some people, cause more aggressive behavior. So perhaps that was enough to people who are already on the top of the dominance hierarchy or a bit more dominant than other people.
Did they say that could, if something was streaking across the sky, if that could be aerosolized into our atmosphere, or?
So you're hinting at coronavirus, perhaps, or?
No. What I'm saying is,
okay.
So like you're saying this vasopressin, could that have been?
Yeah, vasopressin.
Because could that have been? You're saying if that was coming off of a comet, I'm saying once it hit our atmosphere, could that have been?
Yeah.
You're saying you think it's the cause, but could that have been aerosolized in the air?
Yeah.
Because mostly comets are made up of like ice and different types of
but they
minerals.
also contain They also contain all of these different chemicals. They have a whole cocktail of chemicals in them, and these are also what causes these multiple tails. Because each tail is a different chemical that reacts differently to the sun's heat.
Okay.
So they're sort of spread out. So perhaps this was the cause of this violence. But yeah,
that's interesting.
We don't really know.
I never even really thought of that, I guess, but that makes sense. Now, in terms of, you're saying, this violence, and you brought up monotheism. So back then, obviously, it wasn't like today where you could have somebody that believes in something and not really impose their views on other people. Back then, there would have been a lot of imposing on other people. You have this profound, let's say it's Akhenaten, or let's say it's, one of these Egyptian pharaohs or kings or whatever, and they have this epiphany, or they have this realization, and then they're trying to tell everybody about it, and they're being very evangelical about it. That Akhenaten has been kind of stripped from the record books. A lot of his statues are
the whole thing was reversed again.
So they went back to the old god system. They kind of resented him in that fact, and he moved everything to Amarna, which is a different part where normally the pharaohs would be, and stuff like that. So I definitely think there might be something to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wondered also, in Scandinavia around this time, did something similar happen? So Scandinavia would have been in the Nordic Bronze Age, which is also a fascinating period, about 1,000 years before the Vikings. But near Scandinavia, in northern Germany, I did find this evidence of this large-scale warfare in northern Germany.
And that was during the Bronze Age?
Yeah, during the Bronze Age. Yeah. So on the next slide. Yeah, so around the 1250 BC, so a few centuries later, you have the battle at the Tollens River Valley. And people first thought it was a graveyard, but then they found out that all these skeletons had all these marks of violence, and it turned out to be this massive battlefield, which contained about 4,000 to 5,000 warriors. Some of them sort of proto-knights on horseback. Researchers first thought that the Bronze Age in Northern Europe was quite peaceful and there was no large-scale warfare. But it turned out to be that this is not the case. They did also mention that in the few centuries before 1250 BC, you already start seeing this military class developing, and things are getting more military-like. So it could be that that seems to be linked to the same date of 1500 BC, because things start changing from there. Mm. So was it this chemical from this comet? We don't really know. There are no traces left that would have been washed away long ago.
Is there anybody else talking about that hypothesis at all? Is there anybody else talking about that out there? Like you said, you mentioned it was a friend at NASA, you said?
Yeah.
So do they, has that been tossed around by them too, or they don't really care about like the ancient connection? Or?
Outside of Graham Phillips, I haven't heard about it yet. So maybe when I dig further, I find some more mention of it, but that is really his own hypothesis. It's Graham Phillips' theory that he came up with. And in the year 2024 AD, the same comet 12P Pons Brooks will return again. So if Graham Phillips is right, let's hope not, 2024 could become a very interesting year.
And that's the return of that specific comet?
Yeah, that comet that was also there in 1486 BC.
Is it going to be as close, like Neowise or Hale-Bopp, or is it going to be something a little bit more distant?
I'm not sure exactly how close, but it will come close to the Earth early in 2024. That was what the prediction said. So we'll see how that develops.
Okay. More interesting news.
Yeah. We don't have enough to worry about already. So,
pile it on, baby.
But in the book of Revelation that we have mentioned already, we find this interesting passage that I think kind of connects to this. So it says, "The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch. And it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many died from the water because it was made bitter." So what could be described here is a kind of poisonous comet that poisoned the water. And it's called wormwood because that's this plant. It has this alkaline in it.
I've had it before.
Bitter.
An absinthe.
Yeah. Little absinthe.
Oh, absinthe, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think in Europe is the only place. I mean, you could probably get it where you are in the Netherlands. They keep things right. They don't alter things. But I know here in America, absinthe is now it's just a name of an alcohol that's like, it doesn't have the actual wormwood in it or something.
Yeah.
But I've had the real deal with the wormwood. They call it like the green fairy or something, and it does
turns you into.
It's weird because you don't think that alcohol could do something like that to you. It's a little bit more hallucinogenic than you would think.
Yeah. So and the way this comet is described, it's described in symbols of angels with trumpets and torches. So when you look at it from this angle, you start seeing these symbols emerging, and you can start to build up sort of vocabulary of comet symbolism, so you know better what to look for. So I think that's what the ancients did, and creating poetry out of catastrophe.
I mean, that passage absolutely has to be some sort of comet or asteroid. I mean, there's no way I don't think that you can look at that and think that
very,
it's,
Yeah, it's quite unambiguous about it. It says a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch. Can't get much more clear than that.
Yeah.
So, and in the Ragnarok myth, we find something that's a little bit similar to this. So every god at Ragnarok in this cosmic battle has its own big enemy, and Thor's ultimate nemesis is the Midgard serpent. So, well, Thor is the giant slayer with his hammer, and well, he really wants to kill that snake. He wants that all his life, and now he gets the chance. So the poem says, "The bright snake gapes to heaven above. Against the serpent goes Odin's son. Of the 9 steps, 4 will fall, struck down by the venom of the snake." So here we see this venomous snake, which is described as a bright snake. So we know that snakes are one of the most more known symbols for comets and meteorites. In the Maya, you have Quetzalcoatl and Koopmans, the feathered serpent, who is also linked to comets. So it could be that this bright snake too is linked somehow to a comet, and it also describes these poisonous qualities. Again,
yeah, this is an interesting take. In you think of, obviously a comet's if it were to impact, would be very disastrous, but you don't even think about this other element, which is it could be containing materials that we're not aware of, or that could have an effect on us, like you're mentioning. Could, so that is an interesting thought that I don't think most people think about when they think about this topic.
Yeah, I think a comet might not even have to impact to cause a lot of disturbance, and even if it does, it also creates all these secondary effects. So in the Dark Ages, you have mention of fire and brimstone, and there too they seem to describe the air as being poisoned. You have the yellow pestilence everywhere.
Yeah, never thought about the chemicals coming off it.
Yeah. So, but speaking of serpents, there's also a constellation that we have seen in the previous episodes that's also linked to serpents in myth, and that is Scorpio. Scorpio is, of course, a scorpion, but there's plenty of evidence that Scorpio is also linked to serpents. So we know that serpents are also a symbol for comets and meteors. And we have this constellation that is linked to serpents in myth. The myth speaks of these catastrophes. So if you put all of these things together, then perhaps Scorpio is also linked to comet phenomena.
Yeah, you had, what was it, Ophiuchus with the spear slaying the head of the or hitting that point by Antares up there. So
yeah. So perhaps Ophiuchus is seen as a god battling this demon of darkness, because, well, when a comet hits, the sun gets obscured and you get all this darkness. So you have this battle between the sun and between the force of light and dark. And that is all proven by David Mathisen to be linked to the constellations. So I think all of this catastrophe myth too can be linked to the constellations. And when you look at Scorpio, it has this bright red orange star Antares. So you have this fiery star, and then you have all these multiple rays coming out of it, which can be seen as multiple heads of the Hydra, the snake, or perhaps the multiple tails of a comet. So, and I think there are some other constellations as well that can be linked to comet phenomena. So I think that these memories of catastrophe were passed down in the form of star myths.
Absolutely.
So, what can we conclude thus far? So we have seen these examples of toxic comets, which can be quite lethal, as in the case of Thor, for example. And Thor's battle with this bright snake is also linked to the end of the world. So it is also definitely linked to great catastrophe. And in the End of Eden story, you don't really have a world-ending event as much, but they did describe the more subtle ways in which it can have an effect on history. And it can change the entire course of civilization while not necessarily destroying the entire surface of the earth. So there are all these major and minor catastrophes, and I think these are all reflected in different Norse myths. And not only the catastrophe could be in there, but also simply the awe and beauty that these bright comets would have inspired. That too could be explained and perhaps praised in the myths. So we can ask ourselves, are the gods also comet gods?
Yeah, I mean, so do you think that's what I was asking before? Do you think that do you have any specific examples that you think might be, or is that something maybe we're going to get to here in a minute?
Well, Thor himself can be linked, it seems, to meteorites and perhaps even comets. His hammer is called Mjolnir, which means grinder.
Mm-hmm.
And well, you also have the idea of the cosmic mill or the cosmic grindstone, which eventually sinks into the sea. And in the Finnish Kalevala, for example, it's called the bright lid. It's this bright spinning object. So plus the god of the sky, if he can roll meteorites, if he can roll lightning bolts, then he could also roll these meteorite stones.
Sure.
Which you also find in Phoenician mythology with these betel stones, who are thrown down by the sky god, who's linked to the constellation Hercules as well.
Yeah, and there are myths. I mean, I know there's from the Avestan, which is the from whatchamacallit, I'm drawing a blank.
Zoroastrianism.
Yeah, Zoroastrianism. Yeah. So you have Yima in the Vara, and Yima was instructed to build this Vara, which is some sort of like underground ark or cavern or something, and then supposedly it was like snowing where they were, and they're obviously that's an Iranian region myth. So what was it doing, snowing and being cold in the desert? You know, so there are a lot
of winter.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that you can go to, like whether it's the flood mythology or catechism mythology. There's a lot of it, and it seems to be the more prevalent ones that have been preserved, which obviously means that they're important.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Younger Dryas would have been the most impactful, of course. So I think this will answer your question even more.
Okay.
Because here I have a list of suspected comet symbolism, and here are 4 examples of that. So in the top left, you have the fire demon Surt, who comes at Ragnarok with his flaming sword, and he splits the sky in 2. And then this whole horde of fire demons comes upon the world of the gods. And we know from historical sources that comets were also described as flaming swords. So that could perhaps be another link to comet symbolism. In the top right, you have Odin with his golden spear Gungnir. So perhaps his golden spear too is a symbol for a comet. Randall Carlson seems to think that the spear is one of the 4 it's one of the 4 grill symbols, and the grill symbols are likely also linked to cosmic impacts during the Dark Ages in Britain. And in the bottom left, we have the golden necklace of the goddess Freya. And there is a Norse myth in which Freya is angered, and then her golden necklace falls from her, and then the mansions of the gods tremble. So perhaps that too describes something golden falling out of the sky, causing earthquakes. And in the bottom right, we have a more subtle symbol in the golden hair of the goddess Sif. I think a lot of characters in myth with golden or red hair, or even hair with snakes, can be linked to comets as well. The word comet itself means long-haired. It's come from ancient Greek komai, which means letting the hair grow long. And in the myth, Sif's hair gets cut off by Loki, and then the dwarves have to forge new hair out of gold for her. And we know that comets too can grow these tails and then lose them again. So perhaps it could be linked to that as well as several other phenomena.
Yeah, so and everybody that doesn't know, the tails of the comet is the debris burning up or being shed behind it, causing this. You're seeing the remnants of that. When you look at this, though, do you think that these are like the necklace falling off of Freya, and the correlation with the red hair? Well, obviously we know people indigenous to the regions of the Scandinavia, there's red hair is prevalent. Red hair is prevalent in Greece and stuff too. So so when you look at that, I mean, I guess I could see that, but I think that when you look at these things, we still do it to this day, right? I mean, I don't know if you've heard this, but I mean, as a kid, I would see stuff on TV, or you have an aunt or something, and when it's thundering out, you say, "Oh, God's bowling right now," or something like that. So, I mean, do you think that this is like an ancient version of that, or do you think that we inherited that? I guess I don't even know how that we've over time we've kind of lost our touch with these myth-making abilities, but that we still try and do it here and there, but it's not as serious as it used to be, or something like that.
Yeah, I think for the ancients, the world was more filled with meaning, and I think they had a better idea of how all the things were connected to each other. They were thinking more in terms of symbols, and how things are alike. So a snake, for example, is similar to a rope, or sound waves. Or energy, so they were thinking on this symbolic level. So things that look alike, they are connected together and seen as similar things. And you could say that form is related to function.
Right.
So when you look at it from a science point of view, you do actually see that the form, the shape of something, does determine its function as well. So that's how you can connect all these things that have similar characteristics, and then you can see how things are connected, and all these hidden forces that are at work that determine our reality. Okay, so now we're getting to the end of the Ragnarok myth. And we will see how the world eventually ends. So the poem says, "The sun turns black, earth sinks into the sea, the hot stars are rolled down from heaven. Fierce grows the steam and the life-feeding flame, till fire leaps high about heaven itself." So it describes all of the darkness, flood. It says unambiguously, stars rolling down from heaven. So it's, again, pretty clear. So I think they are sometimes deliberately clear, but also at the same time speaking in symbols to create poetry out of these events.
Yeah, I wonder, do you think they've ever looked into like a simulation of what the sun would look like post one of these cataclysms when there's debris and dust in the air? Do you think, I mean, I'm just trying to picture, do you think it would be like the sun trying to peek through the clouds, like how, or like a dense overcast, or do you think that it would be black, or it would be like almost night looking outside during the day?
I think that would really depend on how thick this dust cloud is. If it's thin enough, you could still see a faint sun. It may have this bluish tint.
Right.
Or if there's this really fine dust, you may have actually a very large, deep red sun. And perhaps, it has been speculated, I don't know if that's scientifically feasible, that you can even see some coronal activity or sun flares with the naked eye. I don't know if that's possible, but you could see the sun in a really different way. And well, if the dust cloud is thick enough, then I don't think you will be able to see much. Right. It could be like night during the day.
Right. Well, that's why I was just curious because of the top part of the poem there.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the poem in Voluspa also describes how the world becomes new again, because we want, of course, a happy end to the story.
Sure.
So now do I see the earth anew, rise all green from the waves again. Waterfalls flow and the eagle flies, and fish she catches beneath the cliffs. In wondrous beauty once again shall the golden game pieces be found in the grass, which the gods had owned in the days of old. So some of the gods have survived Ragnarok. And they sit in the grass, which is all green again, and they find these golden chess pieces, and then they put them back on the board, and then this whole cosmic game between the orders of the force of order and chaos, it starts again. So the cycle is repeated, and there's a new golden age.
Do you think that, and again, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but like almost like simulation theory, like even back then, whether it be, you know, Clash of the Titans or this or whatever, there's this idea that there are people up in the clouds, and back then that's what it would have been, because we didn't really know about space travel and that kind of stuff. But there's these gods or these ultimate beings sitting up in the cloud playing us like we're a chess game, or like we're on a chessboard. And if you look at simulation theory, that's kind of somebody would be creating us, or the way that we play video games and create avatars and worlds within, you know, that kind of a thing. So I do think about that sometimes.
Yeah, I don't really. I've heard the simulation theory mentioned. I think the world that we live in could mimic a simulation, because maybe it would need the same principles to function as, in a way, computer programs might do in some ways. So, I really don't really know about that. I don't really think that we should take the idea of these beings controlling us that literally, although I don't know you. Perhaps there is this giant brain floating out there that knows everything. Or
yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily
we don't really know.
Yeah, I don't mean necessarily take it literally, but other than the fact that the simulation theory is a real theory that some of the most intelligent people that we have in our society today takes, Elon Musk and Nick Bostrom and all these theoretical physicists and stuff, that the probability of that existing is very high. Now, does that, you know, you could make the argument for a simulation, like you said, to exist, it would have to be a simulation of something else. So almost like you would look at like Plato's theory of forms, where we have this reality, but this reality is actually taken, the forms and this what we experience is taken from a different realm, or is copied from a different realm. So
well, it does seem that there are these different dimensions to existence that we are not really aware of. We are really tuned into only this one channel with our brain that we tune into, and basically the whole world that we experience is a kind of simulation created by our brain as well, of course.
Right. Yeah, and I'm not. I don't necessarily believe the simulation theory, but I do think it is interesting. I definitely think about it a lot, because there's a lot of things that could be correlated to that, especially from the ancient world. Maybe it's a little bit more crude the way they explained it, but it's that.
But I think these giant comets too. You could also see them as these beings controlling our lives. Yeah. Because they determine our destiny. Will we survive or not? It depends on whether a giant comet will hit us that's large enough. Right. So they controlled the fate of the dinosaurs, then the mammals took over, and now here we are. So I think those can be seen as kind of controllers as well, though maybe they're not aware of it themselves.
Right.
So, okay, let's get back to the poem. In the final stanza, the seeress says to Odin, "From below the dragon dark comes forth, Nidhogg flying from Nidafjord. The corpses of men on his wings he bears, the serpent's bright, but now I must retire." So we see that everything is great again, but this serpent has survived as well, Nidhogg. So there will always be this lurking threat. We have survived several catastrophes as human species, but we know that there are still some pretty big chunks of rock out there. And we know that there will come a time when this threat returns. So it will be about 1,000 years before the Earth again passes the denser part of the Taurid meteor stream. So somewhere around the year 3000, we should get again the worst of it. So we have quite some time.
Hopefully we figure things out.
Something to look forward to, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
Hopefully we figure things out, so at least we can get off this rock if we need to.
well, something thought that the world would end in 2012. Graham Hancock thinks perhaps 2040, but I think this is quite an optimistic scenario. We have perhaps another 1,000 years to figure things out, if we don't destroy ourselves, of course. So perhaps we will be able to prevent it, unlike Odin. He tried to do everything he could to prevent it, but he failed. But perhaps we, as human beings, will have the power to take destiny into our own hands and perhaps avert this cosmic threat.
Yeah, I know that they work on things like, I mean, well, it would be an asteroid, but like creating like a light sail and beaming light at it and pushing it off its course that way. I mean, the blowing it up thing always terrifies me because it's like, well, what if that creates more of a an issue? But yeah, I mean, I definitely think they are working on things to figure it out.
Yeah, perhaps blowing it up would create 1,000 Tunguska events simultaneously over the planet. That would be perhaps even worse than a single large impact.
Right.
Yeah. So the quest continues. So you guys have any more questions? Or
So I guess my question would be, what do you take away from this in terms of, like, does this give you any sort of insight into the way you live your own life, or is this something that you just find interesting, that you think that we should be preserving these myths and maybe the allegory or the message behind them, or how do you look at these things, and aside from just doing the research and being interested in it?
Yeah. So of course it is, intellectually very interesting to be researching this, but the myths, this poetry, every time you read it, it just speaks to you. It has this powerful symbolism. It speaks on so many different levels, and I think also the idea of this cosmic cycles is actually a very optimistic idea, because when you look at where you think that there will be this giant apocalypse, and then after that there is nothing else. I think that's not really a good way to look at things. I think it's a very hopeful message that no matter how bad things get, even on a personal level, if you get through it, there will always be a new golden age. I think the Ragnarok idea, this myth, it works on many different levels. You have all these cycles within cycles. So you also have generational cycles. So every 80 years or so, there is a major crisis. So it's now 80 years since World War II. But Ragnarok, the myth tells us that there will be a new world after that. It's not a definite end. So there is, no matter how dark things get, no matter how chaotic things become in your life, ultimately the cycle will repeat, and there will be a new order. So I think it also makes sure that life is never boring, because it's always in motion. You always have this duality, either working together or working against itself.
Yeah, I had this weird dream recently where I created this robot, and the robot eventually saved us, in the sense that we all got wiped out by one of these events. And it's almost like, the Doomsday Seed Vault or whatever. I forget what country it's in, but there's a vault where they keep all the different, it's almost like a Noah's Ark, but for plants, kind of a thing.
Yeah, in Norway, I think, Svalbard.
Yeah. And
somewhere north.
So it would be something like that, where maybe there'd be genetics stored, or human genetics, and these robots just restart life, kind of a thing. So that was kind of a weird dream, and actually kind of played into this whole topic. But do you think that when you do this research, that how do you keep it so, and I find this hard for myself, and this is why I'm asking, to just jump the gun and go to the next, and just make the correlation without actually putting it through scrutiny? Because I think that there are a lot of researchers that I've seen where the most obvious thing they take and they run with it, but they don't actually put it through the scrutiny and kind of match it up against other things.
So I think time is an important factor in that. I mean, when you get a new idea, you can get really excited about it, and think, oh wow, now I see what the myths are really about. At least in my experience, whenever I have that idea, doubt really starts to creep in real fast. So I don't stick to that one idea and just keep going with it. I will have major doubts and think, have I been crazy all this time? Have I been chasing something that isn't there? And then, that prompts me to research it further. And I think time is a big factor. I've been looking at the Comet angle for quite a while now, and if you just have to put in a lot of research, compare all these different myths, explore it from all these different angles, and then you start building this vocabulary. And some pieces of evidence are stronger than other, and you can. When you collect those, you have sort of anchor points also to hold on to. So Martin Strapman said it really well also. When you look at the myths, you can see anything in it you like. You can go any way with it. So if you start from the myths themselves, you can go in any direction. So his research is really rooted in science. So he learned of this relationship between the gods and comets and all that by looking at Göbekli Tepe, and figured out that what it seems to be is a memory of the Younger Dryas impact event. And it's linked to all these constellations. And David Mathisen in turn has figured out that all of these constellations are also linked to the myths and the gods. So David Mathisen thinks the gods are linked to constellations. Martin Strapman thinks the gods are comet gods.
Right.
So I think it also really helps to look at the work of other researchers as well. If there is even good science behind it, or statistical science, as in the case of Martin Strapman.
Well, yeah, he's a scientist outside of that discipline, but I believe he correlated with somebody that helped him with the archaeoastronomy research aspect of it.
Yeah.
You make a good point. I think you need to cross-reference things. And look, I mean, when we go through these slides, and we did the first episode with you, and we did the one with David Mathisen, I think that there's a lot of cool stuff that actually makes a lot of sense that I'm going to look into more. And there's things that I disagree with too. One being the ancient handbag thing, and one of my critiques would be the ancient handbag is also found on Pillar 43, the vulture stone, and there's 3 of them. So that would mean that there'd have to be 3 handbag constellations for that to be true.
Yeah, well, in fact, there are.
Oh, there are?
I've looked at, there are. Ophiuchus is one, but there's also near Ophiuchus, there's Libra, which also looks like a handbag.
Okay.
I forget which the third one is.
I mean, I try not.
Aquarius is carrying this back. I don't know if that's.
I try not to take things literally, but I do want to point out that I do think. I mean, Graham Hancock points this out. I do think that there's some sort of entheogenic connection there to that to that bag. And when I say that, I'm not saying that they were necessarily carrying entheogens in that bag, but recently they found a fox snout pouch in South America that dates back, I think 1,000 years. And you can just imagine that at the beginning of civilization, how were they cultivating the land and with seeds and different things like that. So I think about it from that point. And I'm not saying, again, that David Mathis is wrong or you're wrong or that the ancient handbag sky correlation is wrong. But I do question certain aspects of certain things because
that's very good.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
But I do think that probably they did actually have handbags.
Oh, so, that too. I mean, we have handbags to this day. It's ancient Gucci purse or whatever.
Because I think a lot of the ancient ritual that you find in religion or in this ancient astronomical shamanic tradition, I think, is based on the constellation. So they, it was a way of, you could say, mimicking the constellations that were at that point at the important parts on the sky, and put that into the rituals. So they created. You can create myths out of the stars. You can create ritual based on the myths, or directly based on the constellations. I think in Christianity, even you find all these correlations with constellations.
Yeah, I think that was the only one though that, like, from doing this with you and David, that that I looked at where I thought, I'm not so convinced on that one, but the other ones are very convincing, and they do bring up, he had a nice slideshow presentation too. So I think that we were able to go through and look at more of the correlation between the myths, but and you do it where you're specifically looking at one of these cultures, while maybe sprinkling in some correlations between other ones. So I do think it's fascinating that you can look at these things from different points of view and still get a similar result, which means that there is obviously some truth to it. So,
yeah, I think the myths contain many things, and these are all interconnected. But I think, this astronomical framework is sort of the basis to which all of this is connected. You could see it as a giant memory system, I think. The stars as the index of a system of memory, which holds this whole repository of knowledge. So they had this oral tradition. They didn't write things down in really ancient history. So I think they used the stars as a sort of tool to remember all of these things. And well, I think there's more to star myths than just remembering things.
Right.
But that's one way how you could view it. You could say that the stars are the highest order of existence because it's high up in the sky. That's the world of the gods, the divine. So that's where all other things get linked to, because this high order does have a profound influence on life on Earth, because it's also the realm, of course, where these giant comets come from.
Right.
So what happens in the skies is of major importance to what happens on Earth, and there's the known saying, "As above, so below."
Right.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. But no, I really appreciate your research. I really appreciate what you're doing, and I appreciate David's research as well. And I think that it's a different way to look at things, because when I research things, I try and find correlations in this reality, whether it be similar to what you're doing with the mythology, but more associated with entheogenic things, or the way the mind works and things like that. I do think that it's important to get all these different views out there so that we can kind of see what's what. And I think that I would say that this is a little bit more legitimate than some other things, in the sense that obviously you've put in the time and made the correlations, but just knowing the ancient people, knowing that they looked at the sky every night. And so David mentioned that he thought that this was a little bit more esoteric in ancient times, meaning that not everybody had these knowledge, even though maybe everybody looked up at the stars, that not everybody was aware of these things. Do you have that same sentiment, or do you? Yeah,
I think there was this sort of priestly elite who had this very advanced scientific knowledge, even about astronomy. You see this symbolism of the movements of the sun in respect to the constellations of the zodiac. Symbolism also in precession numbers, so they knew about precession of the equinox. So I think that there was this elite class that had this special knowledge, but I also think ordinary people would also probably had some affinity with the stars, and I would guess that they too could have recognized constellations. So a farmer who is plowing his field, for example, when it's dark and starry night, that farmer too would have seen the same stars over and over again, and developing sort of spiritual connection to it. And maybe, even seeing the myths reflected in it.
Sure. Do you have any questions, Maurice, before we wrap it up?
No, I enjoyed the episode. I learned a lot, and there's some good tidbits to do some more investigation on.
A lot of rabbit holes to go down.
Oh, yeah.
Maurice loves a good rabbit hole.
Hey, there you go.
So what I'll do is I'll add the link to the first episode down below the video after we're done, and also add the link to David's episode, because I think these obviously go hand in hand in terms of what you guys are both trying to accomplish and put out there. And so go to Arthur's website, secretsofthenorse.com, and he's also on Twitter at North Secrets, and he's on Instagram, and he's on Facebook as well. And for you don't have a Patreon, but you do have something on your website where people can buy you a coffee. I bought him a coffee last time. Go check it. Help this man do his research. Get him his caffeine, and
get him that work juice, baby.
Yeah, and also you can check us out at mindescapepodcast.com. Please subscribe to our channel. If you're listening on an audio platform, please subscribe and leave us a nice review. And also, if you are interested, we have a Patreon account where we have exclusive content for $2 a month. You can get that at patreon.com/mindescapepodcast. And yeah, we really appreciate this, Arthur. And shout out to David Mathisen, shout out to Brothers of the Serpent, shout out to Randall Carlson, Graham Hancock, all the people doing all the research with this kind of stuff. And we really appreciate your time and sharing with us your research. And we'll have you on again in the future. I don't know what the topic will be, but I'm sure we'll find something to talk about.
Oh yeah, there's also always a lot more to talk about. Absolutely.
All right, well, we'll do a part 3 sometime in the future, and I look forward to that. And keep doing what you're doing. We appreciate it, and everybody stay safe out there. And we
have
love
a good weekend.
We love everybody, and be safe. Peace.
Bye.